There it is.
How about that?
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So are you working out of the house today due to our fun pandemic, or?
Well, most of the time, yeah. This is kind of where I'm at. We're trying to limit campus in general is limiting who goes to campus and who does not. So, I don't have any work there quite yet. Now, as we return, I'll be going through certain areas, looking at signage and making sure we have sanitizing supplies and all that stuff in all of our building. But yeah, for right now, I'm right here.
A tick list that you never imagined you would have to worry about going through as campus ramps back up?
Never. I was just telling my athletic director the other day, Mike Izzy, who is one of the best, right, that, I haven't done really much on the performance side since this whole thing started, right? Because we've been doing this, but I can tell you, yeah, I'm the one who is presenting our return to campus plan to the AD, who presents it to the president. So I'm informed about things that I otherwise would not be informed on, but rather led by somebody.
So as I didn't necessarily, we talked a little bit before we jumped on, right, about some things we might talk about. And this was not actually on my list, but
right.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to that presentation you did at Indiana's webinar, right?
Okay.
And you kind of presented the high performance model. And your first item after kind of giving a brief slide of that model was standardize.
Right.
And so I assume that concept has got to be serving you well in terms of trying to talk about COVID-19 and a pandemic in terms of how you might go back, get athletes back.
Well, it is, Skip, and I'll tell you, when I originally thought of the title, Performance and Student-Athlete Welfare, I carefully thought that thing out so that I knew how it would be viewed and operated as a job responsibility. And, welfare within our industry is about making sure you're doing best practices, right? You're not exposing people to bad technique in the weight room. Your athletic training room is well equipped and knowledgeable and up to speed in science. Your sports nutrition is exactly that. It's on the edge of performance and health. We have sports psychology, which comes under my oversight, and of course also too making sure. What was a phone call there? We don't end up seeing athletes put in bad situations on the practice field, right? With things that have ended up being catastrophic at times, but even less than that. It doesn't have to be catastrophic to be aberrant, right? So that's where welfare was. Pandemic comes, and now welfare takes on a whole nother meaning. Now it's safety, it's sanitization, it's cleanliness, it's protocol, it's distancing, it's masks, it's PPEs, protective personal equipment. All this stuff that now becomes under the welfare thing, which it is, but you never assume. And to be fair, I work very closely now with environmental health and safety on campus, facilities planning and management, which is capital projects and architecture and all. So I'm going over floor plans and as I think I said something on Facebook about this. This is what we need to be doing, working with those people, because I end up seeing like strength coaches or performance practitioner in general saying, hey, anybody out there, what are you doing with this plan? What are you doing with this plan? Look, what I'm doing right now is I'm managing the plan coming from our doctors on campus, our team doctor, and our director of sports medicine. And then I manage that into, how this is going to happen. There's no strength coach that would ever know what kind of heat is the proper heat level for washing, or which detergent is the best, or, what would you end up spraying your room down with, is it going to be electrostatic? Is it going to be, all these things, right? But you should be, because this is, if you're going to do it the right way, and our position does cover, welfare and health, then there's no way we should be able to do it by ourselves. And so this is a time that welfare is taking on something I never would have assumed. But then again, when you talk to those other areas, environmental health and safety will tell you, no, this isn't our wheelhouse either. This is, we're about circulation from the HVAC. We're about, air quality. We're about, and so it's, we're not encountering anything different, but you're right. I know more about it than I want to, but it's part of the job.
Well, and I suppose if you wanted to get into fundamentals, you could take that term welfare and you could say, we're not necessarily redefining the term, but we're definitely reprioritizing things underneath it, right?
Oh, no doubt, no doubt.
And just no one ever would have, I think, ever envisioned, right, that would be the stack rank, because to your point, unless you're an epidemiologist, and even
right,
if you look into it, even some of them are like, well, yeah, that's my title, but there are slivers of expertise underneath that.
Correct.
And so let me refer you to my friend over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, which I'm going to use that as not the most graceful of segues, but we were talking a little bit before we jumped on. You subscribe to Masterclass, and on Twitter, you put a couple of things up from Neil deGrasse Tyson that really moved into, strictly speaking, talking about what good science is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you sort of see the intersection between fundamental science and then how we talk about what sports science sort of in the performance community. Because, not to write a Hallmark card, you seem to be there's not as many people talking about science in its fundamental terms, but you seem to be one of those people. And is that conscious on your part, or is that something that is part and parcel with your kind of typical vocabulary, and it's just sort of coming out on Twitter or on the socials, kind of in that way? Because I feel like you're a bridge one way or the other. I just wonder how intentional you are being about that.
Depends on where I'm at, right? Like if I'm in the clubhouse or in the locker room, that conversation is a lot different than, when I'm talking to vice presidents and general managers and all that. But still, that doesn't dismiss the fact that, I pride myself in that I follow very closely the science and the results from that science, right? I don't think there's any way to do it. And again, to quote, Tyson, the good thing about science is it's true whether you believe in it or not. And that's the bottom line. Or as Joni Antonio says, you can't have your own science. It's already out there. So, I'm flattered you'd say something like that because, honestly, I listen to people talk and I hear how they present. And the presentation has to be matched by the intellect or it's not believable. Now, that's not to say that I'm so smart that I need to change my words. I need to change my words so I sound smart, right? So, yes, I do carefully choose those, and I like living in that world because that's not our typical world. That's not how we start. But we can say all we want about oh, this is who I am. Okay, well that's fine. But sometimes who you are, nobody really cares about. So I'm not interested in not being cared about. I think I have something to say. I think it's important, and I do want to be heard. But more importantly, any good practitioner is saying something because they think that what they have is the best option, and that's what I think, right? I mean, it's and so yeah, I do cling to the science a lot because it all fundamentally comes back to that and then goes forward. It doesn't go forward and then we find the science. I quickly tire of the crap that comes out that oh, we found it out in the gym 2 years before science found it out. That's absolutely not true. That's absolutely not true. Now, 20 years ago, I would say that. 30 years ago, because the lactate shuttle theory hadn't even been developed yet, and we were still thinking that lactic acid only happens in anaerobics. That's not true either. But at the same time, we we need to present ourselves in an area that, the science is based on that, including the fact that, there's so much science now that somewhere back in there, if you go back far enough, did somebody actually design an experiment of your one-legged ipsilateral lunge jump? Probably not. But if you go back into science and find out what bilateral and unilateral training is, one side loaded, other side not loaded, that's out there. You just got to, you're being asked to put that together. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that not only that we understand the science, but we know how to read it. Because I know this. People just, they think reading a research paper is going over the abstract or the conclusions.
Right.
And that's absolutely not it. Not it. Now, that's fairly conclusive in that area, but you need to know what that all means, right? Like, where did they get these? Who is the population? Who's the author? All these things are part of this deal. So I just tend to like DeGrasse because I think if you listen to him speak, he's just a normal dude, right?
Right.
I like to think of myself kind of like that, but I also don't mind being a normal dude who's got some intellect. And that's funny, that master class. So I think I told you I got a subscription to that, so I can listen to anybody on it. Well, so you should listen to Ronnie Howard talk about directing. He talks in similar fashion, right? Now he's not doing the science in there, but the way he reaches out and jumps into certain areas, you kind of go, holy cow! Like, that's exciting to hear people like that talk on not only a conscious level, but a level that stimulates a whole nother area of discussion. And that's where we have to be, right? I mean, we should be able to do that. And I think that's happening a little bit more. But when you talk about sports science or sports scientists, that's an area that I say, okay, now hold on now. Let's tread lightly in this area until we can grasp what you and I are talking about. Not you and I.
Sure.
But I say to myself, like, okay, and I think this is how it was. I don't think anybody could disagree with me. In the beginning, you were a sports scientist if you ran Catapult or, you took the information from EliteForm. That made you a sports scientist. To which I said, listen, I could take Catapult, and at the time, I could take my 6-year-old son, who is now being able to get on video games, and I could put a Catapult dashboard out there with Skip Cronin on it and say, read Skip Cronin's numbers to me, and he could do it. Does that make him a sports scientist? No, but just reading a computer, that's all you're doing. That doesn't do anything. That's not science, that's numbers. Now, what I do, and most of us do, is I'm not a sports scientist, but I work with the science of sport every day. And I think that's the way I'd rather coin it, because I don't want to insult anybody. Like tons of close friends I have, Andy Fry, Joey Antonio, Sean Arndt, Bill Kramer, I mean, you name it, and people who I've followed for years, Comey, and some of these guys who I've never met. That's insulting to say I'm a sports scientist when they actually have been in the lab following the scientific method. And nowadays, unlike before, a lot of those people now are coaches too. So it's not like, oh, you're just in a lab coat in the room. Not so much anymore. Not even close. Now these guys are actually coaching. Women are coaching, performing these things themselves. They understand a lot better. So I think we still got to come to grips with what a sports scientist really is. But the science of sport is out there already. I mean, that started with DeLorme Watkins back in the 50s and 60s, right?
Good reference.
Yeah.
So do you find, like, because you'll sometimes, I think in a self-deprecating way, talk about kind of how long you've been in the game, right? And then the things that you've seen. So, I mean, because you have like I would say a damn solid background in terms of the language of science, do you find yourself talking a little bit about like what is hypothesis versus theory, and then kind of what that means when we're all standing together in a weight room?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I do that often with, with interns and, younger coaches. And all of that, Skip, starts with a very easy term, intent, right? Why are you doing that? What is your intention, right? I mean, sometimes if you really think about it, I mean, years ago I heard this term, might have been 30, 40 years ago I heard this term. The #1 program in America is mimicry. Right? And where else could you see that? I know that was coming from the bodybuilding area where I kind of, dabbled in for a little while, but you look over and you see a big guy doing something and you go, well, I'm doing that. Right. So,
Right.
I mean, it was mimicry. And so I think, I don't think we're too far off from that. I say mimicry, but then, the squat's been around forever. Nobody's inventing a new squat or a new bench press or a new barbell curl. But this is where the science of sport comes in. Reps, sets, rest, time of year, type of athlete, type of sport. All that becomes what makes the difference between you programming a squat and me programming a squat. Like, I think I'm better at all that other stuff than probably the next guy. And I say probably better mostly because I'm older. I just have seen enough. But I think the hypothesis part is easy to assume. In fact, there's enough science out there to come up with a pretty damn good hypothesis of why you're doing something that, as some people will mention, well, that's never been researched before. Like, specifically, no, but would you really need it specifically? There's plenty of science out there that tells you lots of things. So yeah, I mean, again, it's intent. What do you want to do? Well, I want to build a good, whatever, so let's say I want to work on strength on my legs. Okay. What are you doing for that? I'm doing squats. Okay. What's your prescription? Well, I think that three sets of 10 to 12 is the best. And I would say, well, that's probably not true, right? I wouldn't say it's not completely true because, there's a good chance that you could do 3 sets of 12 at 100 pounds and then 5 weeks later you're doing it at 150. Therefore, you've gotten stronger. So we have to qualify that statement too, right? What do you mean by strong? So that was like, heavy weight.
That's where I was going to go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What is heavy weight? What is strong? All that. So, I mean, again, you got to chop this thing up. And I don't know that that's happening enough. I mean, I think to their credit, there's a lot of great strength coaches out there who should be followed. And so younger coaches tend just to gravitate to that and perhaps don't dive into it enough to say, okay, what are you good at? I've heard some really good coaches say some great things. For instance, we don't do power cleans in my program, to which I like. I mean, I like pulls better, but okay, I like cleans too. I was a former Olympic lifter for a while at a lower level. I like them. I think they work. And I say, well, why not? And they say, because I'm not good at coaching it. Perfect. That's a great answer. It's probably a better answer than most other answers. So instead, we do deadlift, squat, and we do a lot of plyometrics. Okay, I'm in. Can't disagree with that. But if you're saying, hey, I'm doing sets of 5 in the clean because they get my heart rate up, I say, true. But is that what works, or does that work best? Well, it obviously doesn't work best in getting heart rates like that. So yeah, science should back you up pretty good, and that way too, I think it puts you in a spot where your argument becomes less personal, right? Because that's where most of us all go anyway. If you can get yourself back and end up saying like, hey, hold on a second, you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with the science. That's not my fault.
Right. Well, and this goes back to Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
We're wired to think in those terms, right? Like,
right.
We're wired to see what we're familiar with. And so, like, you'll talk about experience, and like people are very fond of quoting like your line about how, tell me what you're doing today and I'll tell you what we used to call it, right?
Yeah. That's only because I'm old.
Well, we can just call that experience instead of old, right?
Yeah.
And so you start to, like, kind of, you mentioned, well, what is strength? Like, a lot of that scenario that you laid out, we can start to ask for definition and ask questions inside of each layer. But as you get to a certain point of experience, you understand, well, the preponderance of the evidence says this. And so you're able to take some things as true and dig a little bit deeper, right?
Right.
And so, like, kind of to your point, like, the coach will say, well, I'm not that great at coaching it. There's a level of awareness there, right? That comes from understanding what you don't understand.
Right.
There's probably a little bit of Dunning-Kruger effect we could throw in there as well if we wanted to.
Yeah.
But so, like, do you see, like, I'm curious, like, so you've seen, like, how to foster and mentor new coaches. There's sort of this combination of mentorship, but sometimes we see apprenticeship.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that kind of falls into well, I know how Coach Alejo's done it. I may not know why he does it that way. And if I'm just
Right.
mimicking, to steal your word,
Yeah.
that's almost apprenticeship, right? Whereas if now I'm
Yeah.
understanding the whys,
Right.
that becomes a little bit closer to mentorship. Do you
Yeah.
like, I heard the pause, right? Do you see things in those terms, or how would you tease that apart?
Well, I do now. Well, and so
Fair.
that goes along with, you know, when I talk to folks about being on social media or just, you know, in just regular discussions or giving lectures, I always say to them, you know, be careful about what you say because somebody might believe you. And I say that because, you know, that's where you have to understand what's going on. So in terms of apprenticeship, and like I said, there's plenty of coaches out there that should be followed. But I want coaches to follow them because they say this is the best way to do it, not because so-and-so won championships. That's not how that goes. You know, it's not, it's, you know, our job, and, you know, somehow there's got to be a way somehow where we can separate that. And there is, but my point is our wins and losses come in developing athletic ability, right? Running faster and jumping higher is what it comes down to. And then injury mitigation. That's what makes us good. So that's what we should be able to look at in terms of apprenticeship. So, I mean, there's also, you know, there's modeling, which would be somewhat, and if you're modeling, and as I model and somebody says, Coach, I watch you do this, I watch you do that, I read what you said, I read about what you wrote, I heard what you said, I'm following that, then that's great. I would think that would be the apprenticeship. The mentorship, I think, comes more into probably something a little deeper. Huh? I mean, you know, why are you into this? Where's your motivation and inspiration, right? Where does that come from? That tells you why you do things, right? And that sometimes says a lot about you too. But in the end, what I've done with my, I'm trying to find here. I found him. I got a slide of DeGrasse right now. What I told our NC State interns was that I changed it into certified only because I didn't feel like we had the time or the need to teach people how to get certified, right? I needed 4 coaches because we didn't have a staff big enough. So I want these kids to coach. That's what I've done here at Northridge. We've got a really good group who I met with this morning. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to use them all at once because, you know, we have to limit contacts and how many people actually need to be involved. But we're going to rotate around. We're going to have an online mentorship for them that they're still going to be taught the right thing as much as we can. But look, I want people to coach, and that coaching, you got to get out and coach. You got to move into it, and I'm going to allow them to take over their team when they're ready to do that. They have to show me you know how to program. You have to talk to coaches, so you got to get involved. We don't need somebody back there with their arms folded kind of watching everything. Jump in there. You got to jump in there and get going. It's the only way you can do it. Won't put you in a spot to fail. I'll put you in a spot to learn. But I want to make sure you're out there coaching so that, you know, when you can actually get somebody to do that, because and I found that out of an accident when my first group that I inherited kind of was ready to go out and do something. The questions I got from the employers were, have they written their own program and have they worked with sport coaches? And I had to answer no to those, right? And I didn't want to do that again. So I made sure you're going to keep writing programs till I see it. Not so it looks like mine, but so that you can actually put it into play, right? You got to put it into play. And once you get your team, then you learn about scheduling and the things that coaches go through and all that. So that part, I think, is kind of embraces the whole idea. But I also think, too, that in my situation, I think it's my responsibility not to spend all my time in a normal situation up on the dry erase board. I need to actually have a team or two so that these coaches can watch me, something I can't put up on the board. And that, to me, cinches it down, which is why, you know, I tell other coaches at other places, if you have interns there, don't have them go with one team. They should rotate to other teams so they can hear all those other coaches and learn the personalities of all those other sports. And trust me, every one of those sports has its own demographic and its own personality. every one of them. And you got to know that. So part of that too is, I wouldn't say it's mimicry as much as, you're looking at modeling, actual, modeling. Now, I wouldn't say it's Pavlovish, but it's modeling nonetheless.
Well, and it sounds like you'd be a proponent of you're experiencing, if we talk about each one of those sports, right? So you don't want to have a singular experience, right? Instead of a singular model and move them around, it's multiple models. So maybe it wouldn't be, potentially it might lack a little depth, but you're going to experience some breadth. Your dog find something outside?
You heard it?
Yeah.
No, he's a monster. He's an 85-pound German Shepherd who he's got a deafening bark, but I promise you nobody will come within, let me see, 50 yards without him barking.
So we have similar work at home experiences. I have a lab pit mix, about the same size, and she gets really upset if someone has the audacity to just walk past our house.
Yeah.
So that's why I took notice of it. I experience it myself all the time.
You got a heightened awareness to that. That's for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. Absolutely. So you touched on something that I want to go back to, and it's a tweet that I had up of yours, and it was basically balancing the idea of like kind of sports championships or winning, basically, if I can oversimplify, and having that be a judgment, maybe that's not the best word, over how effective your program is. And of course it was Twitter, so 120 characters sometimes leaves you wanting more as opposed to less. But like just fundamentally, you alluded to it earlier, but how do you feel about championships as being any sort of judgment against how a program is functioning?
Well, so again, using the scientific method of sorts, right? That would be to say that the strength program at schools that lose is not very good, and that's not true. So the null hypothesis, is live and in living color, and that certain thing. Now, you could argue that. Now, I would also say too, in terms of research and data, when you start stringing together championships, all of a sudden happenstance ends up losing its letters, right? And it becomes
one of the challenges. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's a trend, we would call it, right? So what I was trying to say there was, I was just actually sitting there thinking about how much we, argue. I shouldn't say argue, debate. Sometimes you argue about which program is better, right? Is it cleans? Is it deadlifts? Is it high pulls? Is it Louis Simmons? Is it, all this stuff? But then you go ahead and look at championships across the board. Well, there's so many different programs across the country, right? And, not one team is dominant in the NC2A level, really, and you're also talking about 1, 2, and 3, right? So, there's hit out there, for a long time, Dan Riley and his crew out there at Penn State and the Redskins, they were winning championships and they were using nothing but machines, right? Then you went through the powerlifting phase where everybody was kind of doing that. It was a big deal. And then Olympic lifting came in. And then you have the morph, the hybrid hit system where they are doing some Olympic lifts and some other things, but still going 1 or 2 sets to failure with negatives, which, by the way, is an old method, right? That was the Menser brothers back with Casey Viator and coming off that Nautilus stuff a long time ago. At all. So you can say everything you want about it. You get guys. Power 5 level, Power 5 football, Power 5 baseball, Power 5 soccer, sort of those higher levels. Which is not to say they're the only ones that win those championships. I mean, when I was at Santa Barbara, I was able to be associated with a national championship in a mid-major that didn't have football at UC Santa Barbara. But then you wonder, like, okay, so how much influence do we have? So you figure out that, all those guys are getting pretty much the same player, right? The very, 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 very top are getting kind of the same player. And not every one of those are running the same program. But they're all sharing titles back and forth. So then I think it talks about, so how much influence really occurs on those teams. I'm not saying that the strength program, they shouldn't do any. But then I wonder, where is that? And I think that kind of goes along with people say all the time, but really don't lay on it hard enough, that it all comes down to having good athletes. I'm a better strength coach the better athletes I got. But nobody really says that out loud. They say, oh, look at that team. They won a title. What about that strength program? Well, not the only team winning a title. But again, and that's also assuming there's a strength coach somewhere who's not winning games, but he must be terrible because they don't win games. To which I say, no, that's not true at all, because I don't know where you've coached, but I've never been asked to put in a play in a football game. I've never,
Right.
I've never substituted in a basketball game. I don't make those decisions. So I guess what you're also saying, and this is why I say, we're strength coaches. It's important, not any more, not any less, but at the same time, if a running back has 12 carries for 22 yards, that's not my fault. When we've seen he's got better long jump, better speed, better squat, better whatever, that's not my fault. I can't be associated with that. So we've got to be careful there as well, right? So I mean, I think it's just more of a food for thought. I don't know what the answer is to that. I will say that at the lower levels, perhaps strength and conditioning can more influence winning and losing. It could be the difference, right? But when these kids come in at in Alabama, LSU, and I'll just use those for football because I don't really know all that much better. It's been a long time since I've been with football, but I mean, they're getting kind of the fast, these kids are jumping high and running fast already, right? They're strong already. Now, and I can tell you because I talked to one of those coaches before, we just need to get them in shape to be able to produce at the speed of this game, repetition, the movement, the atmosphere, and all that. And now I can co-sign that because I've seen what happened when I was working with UCLA football, years ago. You could see quarterbacks come in that were, top notch in the state, in the country, and they would get a chance to run a drill. And by the time they took the snap and turned around, they would be putting the ball either into the running back's hip, or they'd get backsided by the guard that was pulling, right? So you're like, oh, that is quicker, right? So, no, it was just a food for thought thing. I got a lot of run on it.
Well, I think one of the reasons you got a lot of run on it is because it's so interesting to think about, right? And so, like, one of the things I thought you almost nicely summarized, because you clearly felt the need to put kind of a second comment up, if I remember correctly. Like, I had it up, but my computer's long gone to sleep. But like, it was almost like there was an acknowledgement, to use language that's outside of the sports world, that there's a cascade of effects that influence winning and losing.
Oh.
And inside of that cascade of effects, a very narrow band of that is strength and conditioning. And really a very narrow band is anything an individual actually influences. And you can just back that all the way out to the point where it actually becomes, if we still from science again, it becomes incredibly hard to measure. But I think there's a value in just the fact that you sort of recognized it in a place of public discussion, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and I purposely do that sometimes to say, hey, we've got to recognize this, right? We got to recognize that, as much as we contribute, and we do, right? Frankly, I think our best contribution is maintaining the health of our athletes. That's the biggest thing. I mean, sure, we're going to take kids that are 18, and they're going to run faster and jump higher that year and the next year and the next year. And, sure, that's going to happen. And I'm sure that helps in some way. But, somebody recruited that kid. Somebody's got the skill to know that kid's going to be faster and jump higher, and he's going to play as a junior and senior and be really good. And that's not our doing. But as important as that is, we have to realize that there's several factors involved with winning and injury. It's not always the strength and conditioning program that gets kids injured. Not always at all. Kevin Kernan just wrote a great article in his, it's called Ball 9. He's a writer in New York. He was talking about where, they had a rash of injuries last year, ended up firing the strength coach and brought in somebody new, and the injuries haven't changed. Okay. so is it that hard to realize by deduction what's going on there? It's something else. It's something else. So just as much as it is winning, and listen, I am not averse to being on a winning team, which I've been many times, and saying, hey, we won this year. How about a little extra something, for
Sure,
me.
sure.
That's when you got to go in there. And when we're not doing so good, I don't make those phone calls and visits, so we just say, hey, that's the way it goes. But that's where I think you need to be in a position, Skip, to be able to say, here's what I directly influence. It's like I say, you got to figure out, and this is where this scientific method thing comes in, right? Where you figure out exactly what it is and what it's not. And I'll read from you right here what I transcribed from Tyson's masterclass. He said, the scientific method is do whatever it takes. And he said it like this: whatever it takes to not fool yourself into thinking something is true that is not, or to thinking that something is not true that is. Whatever it takes. And so it's the same thing. Like, oh, our program was great this year. We didn't have any injuries. I'm never changing that, right? That's a mistake. That's flawed thinking. You got to look at it because there's more to it than strength and conditioning. I mean, it's not as if they were just lifting weights all year and then didn't get hurt. There was something else going on, right? Just likewise, right? All these injuries happen. Of course, as a strength and conditioning practitioner, I would look at the program because I have something to do with the physicality there. But I also have to be smart enough not to blame myself, because then you start reaching verdicts that aren't related to the actual facts. And that's where, later on in that conversation, what he was talking about was saying, be a skeptic, because skepticism is not an outright rejection, right? And as he says, it's a proper skeptic questions what they're unsure of, but recognizes when valid evidence is presented to change their minds. So just because you're saying, yeah, I'm not so sure about that, doesn't mean that you're saying that's crap. You're saying, based on what I know, and hopefully you'll come up with some inferences as to what this is, I'm not sure what you're telling me is exactly true. So influence me. If you influence me to change my mind, it's not better for me, it's better for them. That's what I want.
Absolutely. Yeah. A proper skeptic is always going to be open to a strong argument that might prove otherwise.
Yeah. And I don't think that happens a whole lot in our business.
I'd probably argue it doesn't happen a whole lot in our society right now.
Yeah, because that takes, the odd thing about it is, to be a skeptic like that, you have to be of a different person too, right? I mean, there's a certain person that's only able to say, maybe I'm not right. Maybe I need to change.
Well, and I feel like this is in that masterclass, but it takes more work.
Yeah.
Like you have to, well, one, probably be exposed to the concept, and then two, be willing to accept the work that comes along with it. And it's somewhat similar to, and I think I drive our staff a little crazy with this from time to time, but I speak a lot in terms of probabilities.
Okay.
Right. And that is not, I had to work really hard to even, like, I'm probably not great at it now. Like, I'm sort of just good enough in my own mind to keep trying it. Right.
Right.
And that's going to be my reps to get better. But like, kind of to your point about preventing injury, like, you can decrease the probability that someone's going to get injured. But
yeah, I mean,
point blank doesn't rest on you as the strength and conditioning practitioner to keep 100% of injuries from happening.
Right. Well, so if you take what Tim Hewitt was talking about, so he's right now he's kind of my mentor in terms of ACL and injury and prevention, and his research is great job. And his work leads you to reading some other great work is sure, like Hughes. But when you start predicting, when you start throwing out that kind of data, so when they're saying like we can predict injury, or we can kind of summarize that, he's saying to be careful, because that's a tough one to do, because Well, I think I have it on the same slide here. One of these slides I was looking at here, he says, there's no profession that is more guilty of changing the terms of one single thing than strength and conditioning. Like, it's absolutely absurd sometimes, how we can change names, change titles for injury prevention is one of them. So when you talk about prevention, you're also talking about probabilities and how they come up with this stuff, right? And so he was talking about in one of his papers. So prevention, as I said, I'm reading this here verbatim. Prevention is the action of stopping something from happening or arising. Alternatively, reduction is the action or fact of making a specific thing smaller or less in amount, degree, or size. And so, he talks about the outcomes of these studies measure, prevention. But what he also says is that, if we can prevent an ACL injury, then we can predict one, but we can't. So, probability in our business, I mean, it may be different in yours, but it's a little different. Management is one, managing the data is one. I mean, if you can manage data and there's a 70% chance one thing's going to happen and 30% that it won't, and that's leading you to an area like, okay, that gives you a good idea that what you're doing is in the right direction. But when you start actually leaning on that, I'll give you an example. ACL when they start talking about the data.
Coach, I think I lost you there for a second.
I came back. I was going to say ACL prediction and some of these other prediction models as they talk about. I mean, it can tell you, get you to a point where you'd say, okay, the chances of this happening are better than the other thing. Like, I'll go that far with you. But at the same time, if you're talking about 333, let's say that's 2 for 6, right? So my question to you is, there's 33% chance he's going to get a hit, 66 point whatever, that he won't. Okay. But this is where in sports, intuition comes in. It's like Moneyball that I was part of, right? Billy will tell you the numbers will tell you something, but at some point you have to be intuitive. And intuition is not some magical crystal ball, Swami hat wearing thing. It's a quick flash of what you've seen and experienced. Like, I just think this guy's going to get a hit, or I think this play will work, or I think I'm going to go up 7 kilos instead of 2 kilos on this max. I just feel it. Then I would say to you, let's say 2 out of 6, 333. Okay, which of those 6 at bats is he going to get the hit? Well, who would know, right? I said, well, that's exactly what I'm telling you, right? In fact, over 100 at bats, you're only going to get 33 hits. And so you have 66 times that you're not going to get a hit. Where are they? You don't know, because I want to know where they are. Because if right now is the one he's going to get a hit, I'm putting him in the game, right?
Right.
So that's why you have to be
like people. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's where you got to be careful about some of these prediction models. I mean, when it's overwhelming with some of the early on prevention data with, decreased injury by 76, 70, 80%. I mean, the numbers originally from like the FIFA 11 were like, wow. But then you also got to put that in context, right? The context is you're talking about a group of people that weren't doing anything, right? So if they did something, which is what the FIFA 11 was, and Bert Mandelbaum, who I know very well, was one of those authors. He was one of our physicians at UCLA when back in the 80s and has really done a great job with it. He'll even tell you, like, you can't just keep doing that and not lift weights, not lift heavy weights, and not do other dynamic exercises. But it's the same sort of thing, right? Like, I like probability because what it does do is it gets you closer to conclusion. But if you're going to lean on it really heavy, you better be careful because that thing can get pulled out in a minute.
Well, yeah, and I think you said this when you cut out a little bit, but probability and prediction are related, but they're not the same thing. And
Right.
and those are two terms that get conflated quite a bit. And if you pick the wrong time to do that, you'll really end up with some strange, kind of erroneous conclusions. And then I found it interesting that you brought up intuition because, if we could determine, like, we'll talk about guys who are clutch, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I think most coaches, particularly if they've coached for a long time, just to steal from baseball, there's particular guys that you would like to have up in a key moment.
Yep.
And you might want to have them up there despite, the fact that they're only hitting 275 right now, or, something like that as an example. But there is something about your sort of aggregated experience with them where Bob's my guy in this situation.
Agreed.
And, we can just go ahead and be okay with the fact, like, that there is something about our experience that we can't quantify scientifically, where Bob's the guy. Like, that's the substitution I'm making, right? He knows how to handle the first and third, or whatever the case might be. I play baseball, so it's easy for me to go on a tangent with that. But
okay,
it's sort of interesting. So, like, so obviously you're more than willing to dig in and do research on whatever topic is key to you at the moment. Is there anything you're digging deep into right now other than how to deal with a pandemic? Like, what are your motivations right now in terms of just, like, what are you reading? What research are you looking at?
I don't do as much reading anymore. I mean, when something spurs me, I tend to try to go to the scientific literature because they've got no dog in the fight, right? I tend not to read. I tend not to read narratives. Now, I got a bunch of really good friends that are really good coaches. Some you've already had on there, right? I mean, when you talk about McKeefrey and Tom Morris and Andrea Hootie and you've had, and then any number of other coaches. I'd rather just call people and talk to them, to find out exactly what they're doing because, again, it's like anything else, what you read and what actually happens is different for some reason or another. Right.
Right.
So I want to call, I don't want to read. And that's why the science is good to me, right? There's nothing else to read. You just read what they did and they just say, here's what we did and here's what happened. The rest is up to you, whether or not you agree with it or not. Or not so much if you agree with it or not, or is it compelling enough, right? So when you say, that's there's only a 5% gain there. Well, that might be compelling to somebody at Alabama when they're playing LSU because they may need only 5% to
Absolutely, yeah. Matt Rayo might want to know that. So,
yeah, right.
No question.
Well, Matt's a guy who does a good job with that. I like reading his stuff. And the one thing you can't disagree with Matt is what he's telling you, right? Here's what we did and here's what happened. He's not saying here's what we did and here's what we think would happen. He's saying here it is, right? I think that's important for a lot of people because we don't, we hear about programming and all that, but we don't hear the guts behind it because, again, that's one of those things, that you would have to really dive into and say, is that really the reason why, right? Is that the only thing you're doing?
Right.
Is that the only thing they're doing? What else is happening? This strength and conditioning thing is, obviously I think it's critical. It's important, but I think the more you dive into it, you realize there's so many things that affect what we do and so many things that we affect. So that's why, it's important to be in a high performance model. And listen, I think a high performance model has nothing to do with what level it's at. It has to do with the system itself And I think it's absolutely the best system to deliver the best performance and welfare system to your athlete. There's no question about it, because it's set up, it's tiered, there's reporting lines, and like you saw me speak of, everything in it's standardized, the protocols, the discussion, the language, all of that stuff is very clear, right? And it's very much like a solid team where everybody understands what the other one's saying. Doesn't mean they're an expert in each other's business, but they understand exactly what they're saying. And when you think about it, everybody I just talked about, maybe sports psychology aside, but when you think about nutrition, sports medicine, and strength and conditioning, they all work with the same physiology, every one of them, right? Not in a different way, but they're affecting the physiology that is needed for the best possible performance and health. Now, the customer that athletic training works with is a little bit different than my customer. They have somebody who's probably starting at ground zero if they're in there, or at least at a deficit, right? Maybe not a risk that's unusable, but a risk that's at 50%, 60%, 70%. Most of the kids in my room are going to be at 100% because they're unlimited, right? Same with nutrition. You know, he's trying to affect on the fueling side all those things that we all work with. So that model right there is the one that gets out the best system, so that, you know, we understand how it all works, and that we know that we're only a piece of the pie. Because if you're working by yourself in all these things, it could be an absolute catastrophe. It'll be so chaotic that, well, it certainly wouldn't follow the chaos theory where it's so chaotic it's ordered, right? It'll be chaotic and it'll be miserable.
It would seem like it would almost lead to like a triage approach, I would think, where you're putting out whatever fire is sort of most apparent at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think when you plan this thing out from a periodization standpoint, like I'm all in on periodization. I think people who say periodization doesn't work or doesn't exist, or they're not getting the understanding of what that is. If you're designing a program and you expect an outcome, you are periodizing. That's it, period. Nobody's out there, Skip, lifting weights going, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't care what happens. I'm just going to lift this weight. No. If you're saying, I want you to do this because I want you to get bigger, and here's what you're going to do, that's periodization. You're setting it up. You're trying to set something up that has a goal behind it, and there's going to be an outcome at a given time. But that's you know, again, that's no chaos there. You want to make sure it's a smooth system. But again, the whole piece is that it is integrated, and that there is a lot of moving pieces, and we understand it. Not that it diminishes our importance. I think quite the contrary. You know, if we can get everything bucking up really high at that level, every one of those places, then we got the best possible system.
Well, it's an interesting, I think this exists outside of strength and conditioning. It's an interesting thing when sometimes there is the desire to be seen as someone who's highly knowledgeable, and the fact that you have that knowledge, at times people want to protect it and not share it because that they feel like that's the thing that makes them special, right? And so there is sort of that protective quality people get into, the secret sauce, like some people will joke about. But over the long term, like sort of citing your sources, right? Showing your work is actually how you actually prove you had a hand in the impact. So I always find that interesting. There's sort of that dichotomy that exists.
I would agree with you. You know, so the other thing I used to like watching was, what the guy's name was. I want to say it was called Masterclass, but it wasn't. He would bring on somebody. He was a British guy, and they would talk to people. Anyway, I got to figure out what that was. I'll let you know later, but not now.
Sounds good.
He was interviewing Jerry Bruckheimer, and Jerry Bruckheimer is the most successful producer in cinematic history. I didn't know that. He's introduced Jerry Bruckheimer, so he comes out and he's had these greatest hits from whatever, right? So he was talking about kind of what we do, and I've spent when you talk about getting outside of what we do, I think you have to get outside of what we do for context and contrast, right? So the last couple of years at NC State, I stopped calling my good friends, not that they weren't available, because I made them all available to my staff, and they were, my good friends are very gracious with their knowledge and experience. But I wanted to go outside of that because, you got these interns, all they do is spend their time on Instagram and YouTube and, you know, podcast, EliteForm's podcast and all this stuff. You know, I want them to get outside of that. They can do that. I don't need to do that for them. They're doing that anyway. So I started bringing in people that were outside, that you could say they're on a team. They're about results and performance. They're measuring what they're doing. They're managing and measuring, right? So Jerry Bruckheimer was very much that.